I have completed the registration of our WordPress website in Microsoft Entra ID. So what is next? Well, I need to connect this WordPress website with Microsoft Entra ID. And for that, I need the WPO365 login plugin. So let's switch back to WordPress, to the admin area, where I already installed the WPO365 plugin, the login version in this case. Let's have a quick look. I click install plugins, and when I scroll down, you can see that I already installed the WPO365 plugin, the login edition. And here I can click configuration, or alternatively, I can click here in the menu WPO365. And from here, I can see that single sign-on at the moment is disabled, and I can simply toggle it and enable it. I can continue to the single sign-on tab here, or I can click configure. This will bring me to the single sign-on configuration page. To connect Microsoft Entra ID with WordPress, I would need to specify some information about this application that we registered. And we do that in the section that is called Azure Active Directory, soon to be renamed as Microsoft Entra ID. First of all, I need to select the identity provider, and this is Azure AD. You can leave the default identity provider selected. Alternatively, you could select Azure AD B2C or Entra External ID, but those are different use cases, and there are separate videos for that and tutorials. And if you want to know more about the difference between all of these identity providers, then I recommend that you look at the documentation for this tutorial, where you will find some links that explain more about the alternative choices that you have. So I leave Azure AD selected, and also the single sign-on protocol, I leave that selected to the default selection, which is OpenID Connect. The alternative is that you choose the authentication protocol, which is SAML 2.0. But again, I will refer to the documentation, to the tutorial, where you'll find links that explain the difference between the two. For this moment, I assume that if you selected this tutorial, you know what you're doing. So we will continue with OpenID Connect. Next up is the OpenID Connect user flow. Recommended is that you leave the choice that is already selected, which is the authorization code flow. In case of the alternative, the hybrid flow, the ID token would also be sent to the client, which is considered less secure. And the hybrid flow is therefore not recommended. However, if you would configure support for multiple tenants, for multi-tenancy, then it's actually recommended to select the hybrid flow. But again, that's a different use case. There's a different tutorial for that. For the moment, we just leave it as recommended. Well, next up, there is some information that we need to enter. These are basically the identifiers of our Microsoft tenant, of the application that we registered, and the secret that we created. So let's copy a few details from Microsoft Entra ID. Therefore, I switch back to the tab, and I'm already at the overview page of my registered application. And here, Microsoft made it easy for us. I can simply select to copy the directory tenant ID to my clipboard. I do that, I switch back to my WPO365 configuration pages, and I paste that value. I repeat that step for my application ID. I copy it to the clipboard. I switch back to the configuration pages for SSO, and I will need to switch to the notepad where I copied that secret that I created before. And I copy that secret and I paste it in the corresponding field. Next is the redirect URI. And here you need to be very careful. And we also looked at that before when we register the application in Microsoft Entra ID. The URL that you see here has to be one-to-one the same URL that you have entered on the authentication page in the section for the web platform, it has to be exactly this URL, including trailing slashes. Since version 25, a new option has been added here to actually enable strict mode for redirect URI. I can check that, but in that case, I would need to have a separate page where I expect Microsoft to redirect the users back to after that they authenticated successfully. And in that case, WPO365 will not listen at the root of the website whether there is a user returning from authentication with Microsoft, but instead it will only listen if such a response is received at a specific address. So I could actually then I could create a new page. Let's do that quickly. And let's add a new page. And let's call that page auth OIDC, OpenID Connect. So the authentication landing page for OpenID Connect. I leave it very simple to this. We don't need anything here. We don't need any content. I just want to, I can view the page basically. I just copy that URL and I can now enter this URL here. But if I do that, I would also need to update Microsoft Entra ID. On this page, I can, for instance, add that URL. The URL is okay, and I can save my changes. I can basically close this page, and I can go back to my single sign-on configuration, and I've enabled strict mode as well now. Is that necessary? No, not necessarily needed. But in some cases, when you have multiple providers, it may be good that you say, okay, from Microsoft, I expect the response exactly at this address. In all other cases, if you don't have any problems, you actually don't need to enable the strict mode for the moment. A few other options that I leave as they are. If you're interested, if you think they apply to your situation, where you not want to verify the ID token that you receive, or where you want to ignore third-party ID tokens, I leave it up to you. You can read the documentation whether you need it. Other options are premium options. You can click actually to see what kind of premium add-ons would unlock that option. And also the option to enter a domain hint, I leave that empty for the moment. Domain hint, you don't need to enter it unless users start complaining that by default, if they sign in with Microsoft, they're signed in with a wrong Microsoft account. It's possible that users have multiple accounts in multiple tenants, and Microsoft once in a while, when the user comes to authenticate, then by default select the wrong tenant. In that case, it might help to add a domain hint, but if you do, then make sure that the domain hint is the domain used for login names, for usernames. It's not the website's domain that you need to enter here. So, for instance, in my case, if my email address or my login with Microsoft is marco@wpo365.com, then the domain hint here is wpo365.com and not, for instance, wpo365connect.com, as would be the website domain. So far, the configuration of the Azure Active Directory section for single sign-on. One last step before we can test our configuration, and this is that we need to make a decision what kind of authentication scenario you would like to use, I would like to use. And I have the option basically between two. The other options that are grayed out are premium options. With these two premium authentication only scenarios, WPO365 will not try and match the user who just authenticated successfully with Microsoft to match that user with an existing WordPress user or create a new WordPress user if such a user cannot be found. In my case, I can choose between an intranet authentication scenario, and in this case, all users that try and access a WordPress page or post from my website are forced to sign in with Microsoft. If I select the internet authentication scenario, then only users who try to access the WordPress backend are forced to sign in with Microsoft. So, Let's leave this for internet for the moment and let's save the configuration. Here I will see a pop-up that reminds me that if I use a server-side cache, now is the time to purge that cache, to refresh that cache, because depending on the authentication scenario that you selected, pages may not just be available to anyone anymore, but the plugin may sit in between and may actually block access and will send users to Microsoft instead. So I click confirm that I've read that information, and now I can continue with the plugin self-test.